Hi, everyone. Happy Sunday. We're going to get started in just a little bit, just taking care of a few technology items before we begin. Thanks for being here. Happy Sunday. Hope you're having a great weekend. And thanks to all of you who joined our previous program on Ford's Theater a couple weeks back. Appreciate seeing some of you again for part two. And we'll get started in just a few seconds. Hold on, just testing something before we begin. So this is part two of a part two program we having on the Lincoln assassination. So part one had to do with, we talked about the Lincoln assassination and Ford's Theater. And because that's such a large, broad topic, we had to skip a few things. So we have this second part program scheduled to talk about the attempted escape of John Wilkes Booth. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, thanks for joining us. So again, just to make sure everyone's in the right spot, this is the Lincoln Assassination Conspirators and John Wilkes Booth Escape Route live stream history program. We always welcome people to introduce themselves. So in the Zoom chat or the Q&A, if you haven't done so already, feel free to introduce yourself. You can tell us your first name, where you're connecting from, and have you ever been to Ford's Theater? When we do in-person tours before COVID, we used to go around and have everyone introduce themselves, kind of like just an icebreaker, a way to get to know one another. So this is the online version of that. And we don't do a Zoom demonstration for these programs, but just real quick, a couple things that people sometimes want to know how to do is how to adjust the sound volume. So I'm speaking in my normal voice, and we had a sound test earlier. Everything seems to be working fine. If you do want to raise or lower the sound on your session, you can check the settings locally on your own device. If you want to adjust the screen display so that the slides and the video that we're going to be showing take up the full screen, if that's not currently happening for you on your device, look for something called either view or view options or something like that. It's usually at the top of a person's device, depending on what they're using. And you can check off the side-by-side mode. It'll take care of that. And so that's to get rid of, if you see these black boxes that have my name in them, Robert Kelleman, you want to make them go away. Throughout our program tonight, if you have any questions or comments, please let us know, or any technical issues. One of my favorite parts of doing these programs is actually reading the questions and comments from folks, just sharing their perspectives or memories or things like that. So feel free to do so whenever you get the urge. For those of you not familiar with us, we're Washington, D.C. History and Culture. We're a nonprofit community organization, and our mission is to bring people together to experience the history and culture of Washington, D.C. We're currently celebrating our 6-year anniversary this month, so thanks to all of you who participated in our in-person programs the first 5 years we were in existence, and thanks to all of you who've been in our online programs for the past year. Okay, hold on for 1 second while I check something on my computer. And for those of you I haven't met before, either in person or online, my name is Robert Kelleman, and I'm the founder and the director of the Washington, D.C. History and Culture Organization. And of course, I like history stuff. So let's go ahead and get underway. So one of the more popular programs we do, this picture was pre-COVID. This is actually 2 years ago, is we do a tour of Ford's Theater and the Lincoln assassination. In fact, maybe some of you who are in this picture are on the call now. So these, of course, are on hold because of COVID, but we'll start this back up at some point in time. And so what we did was we set that tour up as a online tour. And so we've done it now, I think, 3 times maybe since December of last year. So if you had a chance to join us for one of our previous online Ford's Theater tour, thank you very much. If you didn't get a chance to participate in that and want to check it out, it's on our YouTube page. So there's a recording of it from a couple weeks ago, our Ford's Theater / Lincoln assassination tour that we did a couple weeks back. You can find it on our YouTube page. The name of our page is, of course, Washington, D.C. History and Culture. And supposedly it's the best presentation on the Lincoln assassination and Ford's Theater. It's the best. Well, at least that's what my mom says. So we'll go with that for now. And if you want to check it out in the near future, please do so. And I'll send a link out for that once we're done. But tonight, we're going to be talking about the Lincoln Assassination Conspirators and the John Wilkes Booth escape route. And so let's go ahead and get underway. And just as a kind of a high level, quick geography lesson. So Ford's Theater, of course, is in Washington, D.C. And after the shooting of President Lincoln, John Wilkes Booth jumped on his horse and traveled south through Maryland, as this map indicates with the dotted lines. He made quite a few stops along the way. And then if you go down towards the center bottom of the map where the blue arrow is, Mr. Booth met his demise at Garrett's Farm. He was shot. Well, he's cornered by Union cavalry, and when he refused to surrender, he was shot and killed. So we're going to be talking about that tonight, and all the different crazy things that took place on this 12-day journey after Booth shot Lincoln. So let's go ahead and get underway. Just as an FYI, Abraham Lincoln was born February 12th, 1809. He was shot on April 14th, a little bit after 10 o'clock at night. He died the following morning at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, 1865. And so we always have this program on the Lincoln assassination in April to coincide with the anniversary. We went into the assassination in a lot more detail on our other program, but just as a kind of a recap, John Wilkes Booth, he was a Southern sympathizer. He was born and raised in Maryland. He was very strong ties to the Confederacy. He was a political extremist, in my opinion. He also was a racist. One of the things that really upset him was right before he shot Lincoln, President Lincoln indicated that he was in favor of African Americans, particularly ones that had fought on the Union side during the Civil War, granting them voting rights. And that really upset John Wilkes Booth because he was a devout racist. And he also blames Lincoln for all the South's misery and suffering that took place during the Civil War. So those kind of just a recap of why he shot Lincoln. And let's go through the sites that we see on our tour. So this is a kind of combination history, presentation, and travel tour. What our group does, in addition to the Ford's Theater tour, is we take a bus trip like once or twice a year on the John Wilkes Booth escape route. And I think we've done it now I think we did it for like 3 or 4 years. Of course, we stopped last year because of COVID, and we'll start back up at some point in time. So what I'm going to do is kind of walk through the John Wilkes Booth escape route kind of in the context of the sites that we go see when we do our bus trip. And so when we begin, our first stop is the Surratt boarding house, which is in Washington, D.C., and we'll talk about why we go there. And Booth had a team of people that were helping him in his endeavor, so to speak. We're not going to talk about all of them because a few of them aren't related to his escape. But in particular, we're going to talk about John Wilkes Booth, a picture of him in the top left. He was accompanied by David Harold during his journey, and that's a picture of him to the right of Booth. And also he was interacting with Mary Surratt, that's her down on the bottom left, and her son, John Surratt, that's him to the right of her. So this is kind of the main, there were a few other players involved, but these were the main conspirators that were on Booth's team. And we'll talk about these folks in a little bit more detail in just a minute. And initially, Booth's plan was not to kill Lincoln, but was to kidnap him. During the Civil War, the South had a tremendous manpower disadvantage compared to the Union Army. They were greatly outnumbered. And Booth, because he hates Lincoln, thinks that if he can somehow kidnap him and get him south to the Confederate lines, that maybe he can negotiate Lincoln for some prisoners of war, or maybe, who knows, maybe even end the war or something. So Booth's initial plan was to kidnap Lincoln, not to kill him. And so that's why he has this team of people that are helping him. They were all part of this kidnapping plot, so to speak. But before Booth can kidnap Lincoln, the Confederacy basically collapses and Robert E. Lee surrenders to the Ulysses S. Grant, which doesn't officially end the war, but Lee had a large portion of the Confederate Army under his command. And so when he surrendered, it really put a downer on the whole Confederate cause. And it's pretty much like the ending point is in sight, even if it's not officially yet. So this takes place in April, and it kind of ends or ruins Booth's plan of kidnapping Lincoln, because there's not really much point now. So he is involved with the Surratt boarding house in Washington, D.C. And the boarding house was basically lodging for temporary residents that needed a place to stay in Washington, D.C. John Wilkes Booth met Mary Surratt through her son, John Surratt. He also was a Confederate sympathizer, and he was actually a spy for the Confederacy. So he's living in Marin. He meets Booth. He introduces Booth to his mom, and things kind of go from there. Mary Surratt's role in history is really debatable. Some people consider her kind of a innocent victim that kind of got caught up in this series of events that took place. Some other people are very adamant that she was actively involved. I'll let you read that caption there. I'm not going to read that on the photo. But again, really controversial. My own personal opinion, just to get it out there, is I think Mary Surratt was involved in the John Wilkes Booth conspiracy, but not everyone has that opinion. And if you don't feel that way, if you feel like she was innocent victim, that's fine. I'll basically present the facts tonight and let people decide for themselves. But always an interesting topic of discussion. And there's a movie about Mary Surratt, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So Mary Surratt, Andrew Johnson, who took over for Abraham Lincoln as president, said famously about her, she kept the nest in which the egg was hatched. The egg meaning the conspiracy that ended up killing Lincoln, and the nest meaning her boarding house, because Booth ends up meeting a lot of the conspirators here and ends up planning a lot of his illicit activities here. And here is the Mary Surratt boarding house. So on the left is a artistic illustration of what it would have looked like during the Civil War. And then the picture on the right is a photograph from about 100 years ago. And so the photo on the right is historic, but it's not from the Civil War era. So this gives you kind of a sense of what this building looked like. Hold on for 1 second. Hold on for 1 second while I check something on my computer. Okay. Just to make sure everything was going fine. So anyway, this is what Mary Surratt's boarding house looked like on the left during the Civil War when Booth was involved in that. And it's really close to Ford's Theater. If you're not familiar with Washington, D.C., this is a map that I put together kind of the downtown area. And looking from left to right, you can see there's the White House. And then if you move to where the arrow is, and then if you move towards the center of the map, there's Ford's Theater. So it's really only a few blocks away from the White House, maybe like a 10 or 15-minute walk, depending on the traffic lights and stuff. And then if you look over to the top right of the map, there's a circle where it says walk and roll with an arrow pointing to it. And that's where the Mary Surratt boarding house was. So it was only about a 10-minute walk from Ford's Theater. They didn't even have to take the metro. It was so close they could walk. They didn't have the metro back then, but they wouldn't have needed it anyway. So when you go to this site, they have a historical marker out front, and this is the front and back of that, just to indicate this is a historic site. One of the really cool things about Washington, D.C. is there's historical markers all over the place. So as you're walking around the city, you can kind of check off different things or kind of stumble across different things. And here is the walk and roll today, or the Mary Surratt boarding house. So again, on the left is what the Surratt boarding house would have looked like around the time of the Booth involvement in it. And today on the right, a more recent photo. So it's now a Chinese restaurant. Doesn't really have a connection to Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, I don't believe had Chinese food at any point in time, but it's a pretty good restaurant. I mean, it's not the greatest place, but it's not terrible either. I mean, I've eaten there several times and always thought it was fine. The service has always been good. So if you're ever looking for a meal, go check out the Walk and Roll, and you can walk around inside. Now, it's not a boarding house anymore. The bottom level is a restaurant. The top floor are rented out these karaoke rooms. So if you're into karaoke, you can go check that out. But it's really nice that they still have the building standing. Some people have periodically said, well, how come it's not a museum? And I don't know, that's a good question. I just, because no one ever came up with the money to buy the building and convert it to a museum. So if any of you are millionaires or end up winning the lottery, contact Ford's Theater and maybe you can buy this building and turn it into a museum. But until then, we have a nice place to eat downtown, the Rock and Roll Restaurant. So you can check that out. This is interesting. There's not a lot of stuff to see inside the Rock and Roll, but they do have some like historical information when you first enter. There's a plaque on the outside. When you go inside, they have a kind of a notice. This is interesting. It says Surratt boarding house is said to have where the conspirators plotted the abduction of Abraham Lincoln. Well, pretty much everyone knows that took place here. So I don't know what the is said part means, but anyway, that's what the sign says. So we'll roll with that. So anyway, when we start on our bus tour, we always come by here and check this out. Usually we start in the morning, so we can't stop in for lunch. And then interestingly enough, again, that's the Surratt boarding house on the left. The house where Abraham Lincoln died, called the Petersen House, a picture of that is on the right. And that house is across the street from Ford's Theater, and it also was a boarding house. So just kind of like a historical urban history. These are two really great examples of what kind of common housing units were like during the Civil War era. These were both boarding houses. So interesting enough, the Surratt House looks similar architecturally to the Petersen House. So the house where the planning took place is very similar to the house where Lincoln died. Okay, then we go to Ford's Theater. I'm not going to talk real long about Ford's Theater because, again, we do that in the other program. If you want to check that out, it's on our YouTube page. And here's the outside of Ford's Theater. Here's the inside. Now, I did want to mention something about Ford's Theater just because it's a really important part of the story. And I want to kind of make sure when you leave the program tonight that you understand how Booth got caught. Because I think almost everyone knows that he shot Lincoln and almost everyone knows that he eventually got killed. But how did he actually get caught? Like, what were the issues or concerns or problems that took place? So here is Booth. He sneaks up behind Lincoln while they're watching a play at Ford's Theater, shoots him in the back of the head, as these images are depicting. And then he jumps out of the box, the presidential box at Ford's Theater. I always like to tell people, if you go to Ford's Theater, make sure you call it the presidential box. Don't call it the presidential booth. They kind of frown on that. And here's what the inside looks. So what happens is after Booth shoots Lincoln, he gets in a tussle with this Major Rathbone, who was one of Lincoln's guests that evening in the presidential box. And because of this tussle, when Booth goes to escape, he tries to jump out of the presidential box and his spur gets hung up on the flag. If you're maybe not familiar with that terminology, a spur is a piece of metal on the back of your boot that you would wear to help ride a horse. And that metal piece gets hung up on the American flag. Now, it's a long drop from the presidential box down to the stage. It's 12 feet. And so that's quite a distance to jump. Now, Booth probably jumped up with adrenaline, but he makes that jump. But because his spur gets caught up in the flag, he doesn't land cleanly on the stage and he ends up breaking a bone in his leg, which is really, really important part of the story because it really slows down his escape. And in my opinion, that's one of the things that led to his demise. And so here's a picture of the inside of the theater. After he jumps off the stage, after he jumps out of the presidential box, he runs across the stage. He famously yells, "Sic semper tyrannis," which is ever thus to tyrants. Basically was making remarks at Abraham Lincoln, who he had just shot. And then he has his horse is waiting for him out behind the theater. And he basically runs out the door, jumps on the horse, and off he goes. Now, even though he broke the bone in his foot, he was still able to go across the stage, probably partially just because of the adrenaline. And then number two, he didn't have a real long ways to go. And plus, he had just broken the bone. So that's how a guy with a broken bone in his leg can run across the stage and jump on a horse. But later on, his condition would deteriorate. Now, this is the back of the theater, and I always like to take people here on tours, whether it's a walking tour of Ford's Theater or our bus tour, because there's so many people in Washington, D.C. have never been back here before, but it really is kind of amazing to see the door that Booth ran out of. And so his horse would have been right where those trash dumpsters are. Those trash dumpsters are not from the Civil War era, just as a FYI. And the door also has been replaced, but this is the back of Ford's Theater. Where this right next to where the stage was. And so Booth sneaks out the door, jumps on his horse, and off he goes. Here is our map again of the escape route. So the star is where Washington, D.C. and Ford's Theater is. And then Booth travels south through Maryland, stopping at places like the Surratt Tavern, the home of Dr. Mudd, and various other places along the way. So our presentation tonight will basically be a walkthrough of these different sites that we go see when we go do this on a bus trip. So just as a FYI, our bus trip, what we do is we start off early in the morning. We go check out those couple things in DC, and then off we go. And it's pretty much like a full day long thing. By the time we get down to Garrett's Farm in Virginia, it's getting dark out in time for dinner. Then we usually stop and eat something and then make it back. So it's probably for us like maybe a, I don't know, 12 or 13 hour day. We leave at like, I don't know, 8 o'clock in the morning and we come back at 8 or 9 o'clock at night, just as a FYI. This is the route that Booth took. This is his escape route. He's traveling through the alley. And then he turns onto the street and off he goes. Here's an aerial view. So you can see the red star on the left is where Ford's Theater is. Where the line begins is where Booth had his horse waiting for him. And then he rides the horse, basically the path that the red line goes. If you're familiar with Washington, D.C., that building on the top right of the aerial photo is the National Portrait Gallery and the Smithsonian American Art Museum, just to give you a context to where that's at. And Booth is on his way to Surratt Tavern. So Mary Surratt, in addition to have the boarding house in Washington, D.C., she had a tavern in Maryland, and that's where Booth is headed to. Let's see. Now, there's a river that separates Washington, D.C. and Maryland, the Anacostia River. And this is Booth's first big challenge after he gets out of Ford's Theater, because he has to cross this river, which might not seem like that big of a deal now, but during the Civil War was a big deal because, first of all, they don't have as many bridges back then as they do now. And the Union Army was guarding all of the bridges. They were always concerned about for people basically causing ill will to the Capitol. And so it's under guard 24/7 and just kind of make sure that nothing happens. And so Booth has to contend with that. He has to get across the river into Maryland. He obviously doesn't want to stay in Washington, D.C. after he shot Lincoln. This is a photo from a few years ago. This is like looking across the river. This isn't the exact spot where Booth crossed, but it gives you a sense of, you know, it's pretty far from one end to the other. So this is on the Washington, D.C. side looking towards Maryland. And so, you know, you wouldn't be able to swim with a horse across there. It's not an insurmountable difference, but or distance, but you wouldn't be able to get across easily. So he's got to take the bridge. And this is a photo of the area. So this is the bridge that he took. And again, it's being guarded on both sides by the Union Army 24/7. And what they would do is they would not allow people to pass after 9 o'clock at night. And Booth shows up here around 10:30 because he shot Lincoln a little bit after 10 o'clock. It takes him a while to ride his horse from Ford Theater to this bridge crossing. And when he gets there, he's stopped by the Union Army guards, basically telling him that he can't cross, that it's, you know, past curfew. And he protests and uses his influential manner to basically show the guards that he's of no harm. And plus, also, he's leaving the city. So there's less security risk for someone leaving the city than entering one. And so they basically waved him through. The security was a little laxed at this point in time because, again, Robert E. Lee had surrendered and people are thinking the war is winding down. Well, then a few minutes later, his buddy David Harold comes up to the river and same thing. Now, Harold had a little bit harder time crossing the river because he wasn't as smooth of a talker as John Wilkes Booth was. But eventually he told the guards that he had come into Washington, D.C. to visit a, quote, lady friend of his, wink, wink, and that he needed to get back home to get some sleep. And so they waved him through as well. So just interestingly enough, again, Booth has to cross the river. It's his first big challenge. He has to cross the Anacostia River from Washington, D.C. to Maryland. This is the crossing. This photo is actually from that era. Gives you a sense of what it would have looked like. it was a pontoon type bridge, and Booth and Harold make it across. And off he goes. So interestingly enough, Booth gets a lucky break because he actually hooks up with Davy Harold. They hadn't figured out like a designated place to meet. And so they were both headed toward Mary Surratt's tavern. Booth doesn't know if Harold's ever going to be there or not. And they just so happen to run into each other along the way. So that was a really fortunate break for Booth because Harold was really able to help him a lot during his escape route. So the fact that these two guys were able to meet up with one another and they didn't have a pre-designated place. And, you know, this is, of course, remember before cell phones and, you know, texting and all that stuff. So they basically just met in the city and said, yeah, we'll do our stuff after 10 o'clock and let's meet up in Maryland. And then off they go. So really kind of an amazing coincidence or lucky break for Booth that he meets Harold, because Harold is going to end up helping him quite a bit. So off they go, and they're on the way to the Mary Surratt Tavern. So let's talk about that. So here is the Surratt House, it's called. This is a museum that you can go visit today. It's in a place called Clinton, Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C. And again, it's owned by Mary Surratt. She also owned the boarding house in Washington, D.C. She also owned this establishment. And to give you a sense of where it's at on the map, see where the blue arrow is. And here it is on the map, just to give you a sense. So it's not really all that far from Washington, D.C. If there's no traffic, you could get there in probably like 30 minutes from Ford's Theater. If there is traffic, it might take you 2.5 hours, but that was kind of before COVID, the traffic not quite as heavy as it was. But anyway, it's not all that far. And so Booth ends up riding a horse this distance. You can drive it. Now, one thing to point out is now Abraham Lincoln is really popular as a president. And typically, if you see polls of people indicating who their favorite president is, Lincoln's at the top of the heap. But that wasn't always the case, especially during the Civil War era. So this is the election of 1860. And what I wanted to point out is Lincoln only got 40% of the popular vote. So 60% of the people in the United States, or what was then the United States, voted against Abraham Lincoln. So he wasn't popular with everyone. And in Maryland, he was particularly unpopular. So these are the results of the election of 1860. And if you go down to the bottom, or the second row from the bottom, where it says Abraham Lincoln, look, he got less than 2.5% of the vote in the state of Maryland. So he's not popular there. And so the reason I'm pointing this out is there's a lot of Southern sympathizers in Maryland during this point in time. Southern sympathizers are people that are supporting the Confederacy, but are living in the Union states. And that's what's taking place here. This is a picture outside of the Surratt boarding house. These pictures that I'm showing you tonight are a combination of a million different sources. Some of them I took myself, some are from friends of mine, some are from the museums themselves, some are from different like public domain sources, et cetera, for all different types of pictures. But this is our first stop in Maryland, Surratt House. They have historical markers. I'm not going to stop and read that, but people can when they visit. And this point in time, this was a really small community. There was only a few dozen people living in the quote unquote town. And so kind of one of the main buildings was Mary Surratt's boarding house. Now, remember, Booth initially planned to kidnap Lincoln. So he had familiarized himself to a certain degree with this area, because after he kidnapped Lincoln, he was planning on somehow transporting him by horseback or carriage or wagon or whatnot through this area down to Virginia. So the kidnap route was very, very similar to his escape route. Of course, he did not use the kidnap portion of the plan because Lee surrendered. But that being said, that's why he knows a lot of these people like John Surratt and Mary Surratt and David Harold and et cetera, because they were living in this part of Maryland. They were Southern sympathizers. They were receptive to Booth's plan to kidnap Lincoln. And here's the Surratt House today. Has this really interesting red color. And this is where Booth and Herald make their first stop. They go to pick up, they were supposed to pick up 2 rifles, but they only ended up taking 1 of them. And they were also going to get some supplies. Booth, in particular, was extremely thirsty after his hard horse ride. And also his leg was really bothering. So he had some whiskey while he's here. They didn't stop for too long, though. Here's another historical marker. Some of these things, like the historical markers, I'm just showing you to kind of give you a feel for what's there. We don't unfortunately have time to kind of stop and read every single word on every single slide, but suffice to say, this is being recorded for our YouTube page, so you can always go back and hit stop screen if you want to. So this is a really great site to visit. Not only is it connected to the Abraham Lincoln assassination and the John Wilkes Booth escape route, it's also really fascinating to find out kind of how people in the mid 1800s lived in this particular part of the world. Usually when we come here on our trip, we usually budget about an hour to stop here, just as a side note. And they always have people working here that are dressed in period costumes that kind of tell you about the place. This building was because it's a small town, it served as a variety of functions. It was a boarding house, it was a tavern, it was the post office, you could vote here, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the inside. They've done a great job of restoring it to make it look exactly like it would have during the Booth time. So this is the inside. This particular section is like where the office, this is basically like the check-in counter like you would see at a hotel. Those boxes in the background are for mail. And then of course they have drinks and stuff if someone wanted a alcoholic refreshment. Here he is sorting the mail. And the historical interpreters they have here really do a great job of explaining the house and what activities took place here, either the ones related to Booth or otherwise. So definitely a worthwhile stop. If you're in the Washington, D.C. area and you don't have time to do the full John Wilkes Booth escape route, because again, it takes like a whole day, you could, if you only had a little bit of time, you could at least come to this house or this one and the Mud House. So just wanted to point that out. There's a runaway slave poster. Maryland was a slave state during this point in time, even though they were in the Union. Here's Mary Surratt's portrait. So even though she owned this house, she wasn't living here. She was living in Washington, D.C., and a guy that she knew was basically running the establishment for her. And it's neat just to kind of walk around and see what this old house looks like with the furniture and stuff. And so when you go here, again, the historical interpreters will talk about what life was like, how they cooked their meals, what kind of work they did here, et cetera, et cetera. So they do a really excellent job. Cooking was and cleaning were much harder back in the 1800s than they are now. So again, just some pictures to kind of give you a sense of what you can expect to see when you come out here on your trip. Here is upstairs master bedroom. Booth didn't end up staying here on this particular journey. Now, this is an important spot. This is, so Booth kept 2 rifles here, basically storing them here. And when he shoots Lincoln and then heads away, he has to travel very lightly. So he doesn't have a lot of stuff with him. So he basically wants to have more weapons at his disposal on his journey. So in preparation of that, he stores 2 rifles here. Now, this is during the Civil War. The Union Army knew this was a hotbed of Southern sympathizer activity, and they would frequently search houses and if something suspicious was going on. And if people had large amounts of weapons, that would, of course, draw a lot of attention or suspicion from the Union military authorities. So these 2 rifles were being hidden by Booth in the floorboards here, and he shows up to claim one of them. This is the passageway up to the attic. That's what that gentleman is opening. And again, they had to have a lot of historical programs here for children and adults. So you can check those out. Of course, those are on hold because of COVID, but they'll resume at some point in time. This is a funny photo. This was the meeting of the Abraham Lincoln reenactors. And they have a museum, like in a gift shop across the way. Now let me do this. I have a quick video that I wanted to show you. This is actually put together by the house itself. Let's watch this, and it'll be a little bit kind of a more overview of the Surratt House.
It was a family home, a tavern, a post office, a hostel, and even a polling place. But those aren't the reasons why thousands of people visit Surratt House Museum every year. Its involvement surrounding one of the most renowned assassinations in history, the killing of President Abraham Lincoln by John Wilkes Booth, is why Surratt House, an ordinary mid-1800s plantation home, lives in infamy. Located in what is now Clinton, Maryland, the house gives a feel of what homes were like during the Civil War era. Though the kitchen wing has been rebuilt, the home still has the original flooring and several items owned by Mary Surratt, the former owner of the home, who became the first woman hanged by the federal government after being convicted as a conspirator in the Lincoln assassination plot. The home was a Civil War safe house for agents of the Confederate underground and soon became involved in the kidnap conspiracy that led to Lincoln's murder. It was the first place that Booth and his accomplice stopped while fleeing Washington, D.C. after killing Lincoln. His leg broken during his escape from Ford's Theater, Booth stopped at the tavern for some whiskey to ease his pain and to pick up supplies for his escape to Virginia, which included a gun which was hidden in the attic a month before as a part of the original kidnap scheme. After Booth was killed in a showdown 12 days after the assassination, a hidden gun, which Booth left behind, was discovered by authorities. It was lodged in the wall between the kitchen and the dining area. During the investigation, authorities cut through the wall to retrieve the rifle, which became a key piece of evidence in Mary Surratt's conviction. In 1976, the museum was opened as the first public historic house museum in Prince George's County. With tours available Wednesdays through Sundays, Surratt House Museum still tells the story of desperate times and desperate deeds during the American Civil War and gives a glimpse of what life was like during that era. So please, visit us at Surratt House to get a glimpse of yesteryears and to learn more about the conspiracy which changed the future of America forever.
Okay, so during these programs, I always like to give a shout out or publicity to other organizations that do great work. And I really like what the Surratt House does in terms of historical interpretation. So be sure and check that out. And there's a film that came out a few years ago called The Killing of Mary Surratt. It's basically about the execution of Mary Surratt, which took place on July 7th. So we're going to have a film screening and discussion of it periodically. Our group streams films and we talk about them before and or afterwards. So if you want to come join us for that, I'll be sure and send out the invitation for it. Now, it's not on our calendar yet. It won't be out on our calendar until probably June 7th, but you can kind of make a mental note of that. And hopefully you can come back and join us for this film screening, The Killing of Mary Surratt. Now, one of Mary Surratt's downfalls was the reason why she was convicted of assisting Booth, in addition to many other things, is the afternoon of the assassination, she rode out here via carriage from Washington, D.C. and told the guy that was managing the property to basically get those rifles ready. She called them the shooting irons, get the shooting irons ready. So the fact that she came out here and told him to get the guns ready, that someone would be coming by shortly to pick them up, kind of indicated that she had some kind of knowledge potentially of what was going on. Let's see. So let's talk about the Mud House, the infamous Dr. Mud House. This is in a place called Waldorf, Maryland. And again, if you don't have time to take the whole entire Booth escape route trip, you could probably do the Surratt House and the Mud House in like a half a day if you were pressed for time or couldn't go that far. Here is Dr. Mudd. And there's where they're gotten on the map. So Booth actually made it quite a distance. He probably showed up at Dr. Mudd's house around 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. And after shooting Lincoln a little bit after 10. So he actually covered quite a bit of ground when you can figure he's riding on a horse with a broken leg at night through the countryside. So he made quite a bit of ground these first few hours. And again, remember when the shooting took place after he shot Lincoln, he in his escape attempt, tries to flee the presidential box. His spur, metal spur on the back of his boot, gets hung up on the American flag, which is ironic that he got tripped up by the Stars and Stripes. So the Stars and Stripes actually proved to be one of the downfalls to John Wilkes Booth, ironically. But remember, he breaks a bone in his leg. He's in a tremendous amount of pain as time goes by, as kind of the adrenaline from the shooting wears off. And as his leg gets more and more, the effects of the injury start impacting him more and more, he's in a great deal of pain throughout his initial horse ride. And so they decide that they're going to have to get some kind of medical treatment for him, which wasn't part of the initial plan. Although he had met Dr. Mudd, they weren't planning on stopping there after the shooting. They were thinking maybe that Dr. Mudd would help them some way in the kidnapping plot, but not so. And if you look at this map, this is an important point. So I want to make sure that you understand this. And again, I'm trying to highlight the things that caused Booth to get captured. So you see where the Surratt House is in the center of the map. And then if you're driving this route, you follow the blue path. And you can see it's not very far. It's like 14 or 18 miles or 20 to 30 minutes, depending on how far you drive. But what happens is where that red arrow is, that's where Booth was supposed to go, towards the river to the Virginia border. So he had to take a detour. So basically where that fork in the road is, where it says Delight, was not really a delight for John Wilkes Booth. So there's like a fork in the road there. Booth would have preferred to go to the right or go towards the southwest and head towards the Virginia border, but he has to get medical treatment for his leg because he's in excruciating pain, and it's getting worse by the hour. And so he detours off and goes to Dr. Mudd's house, which he just so happened to know Dr. Mudd from his kind of reconnaissance activities that he had done before. This is a aerial photo. I just wanted to show you this to depict this is a really rural area, even now, and so would have been even much more so back in 1865. It's very dark out here at night. There's not businesses and stores and lighting and stuff like that. It's really, really dark. This twilight photo gives you kind of a sense of that. So someone traveling through here at night would have really had a hard time finding where they were going, because there was just a faint amount of moonlight, and there's no street signs. You don't have GPS and cell phones and all that stuff. In fact, to give you a sense of how dark it is out here, I actually took a photo one night when I was traveling through here. And this is my photo I took one night out here. Well, no, not really, but it gives you an idea. It's just, there's not really much out here in terms of light. And here is the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd. John Wilkes Booth rested here for several hours on April 15th, 1865, after receiving treatment for his broken leg. But again, I can't stress enough how important it is, the fact that he had to take a break and detour from the way he wanted to go to get his leg healed or treated or whatnot. Treated, we'll say. And then this is a site that you can visit today. They also do an excellent job here of an historical interpretation. This is a great place to visit. Very similar to the Surratt House, they do an excellent job of not only interpreting the events that are related to John Wilkes Booth, but also just to kind of give you a sense of what it was like to live during the Civil War era in this part of the country. Here's some pictures of the outside of the house. Here's the parking lot. This is looking from the house towards the street. That kind of road in the center is like their driveway. And you can see some houses kind of in the distance. Those probably were not there, or there were probably no structures there. Those houses definitely weren't there, but there probably weren't even any structures there at this point in time. Here's another view of the house. So again, this is the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd. just different photos I've taken from different trips out here. Again, I've been out here several times. And kind of like the Surratt House, the historical interpreters are dressed in period costumes. And they give you tours of the house. This is also, so I'm originally from Detroit. I'm from an urban area. And so to me, it's always interesting to go out to these kind of rural areas and see what life is like. And so kind of interesting just to kind of walk around this farming area and see what it looks like and take pictures. So this is pretty far off in the distance. So I walked quite a ways away from the house. And then the house is over on the left side of the photo. So just, again, some pictures to give you a sense of what it's like out here. Now, what happens is Booth shows up late at night and he has Dr. Mudd treat his injured leg, which he couldn't do a lot for it. He basically confirmed to Booth that he had, in fact, broken a bone in his leg, and that was going to be a challenge for him moving forward. If he was not able, normal circumstances, if someone would have had that kind of injury, they would have been bedridden for a few weeks while the leg healed. But of course, Booth can't do that because he's on the run. So he's basically staying in the upstairs area of the house, getting some rest because, figure he'd been up all night after he shot Lincoln and rode away. So he wants to get some rest. There's just some information on the house. I'll skip over that because I'll basically explain the information that's on this text. And here's a portrait of Dr. Mudd. And it's a really nicely furnished house. Dr. Mudd was a doctor and also a farmer. He had quite a bit of, I think he had 200 acres that he was farming. He did have slaves at one point in time. And of course, he's a big Southern sympathizer. And so he meets Booth through mutual friends, and they both share a admiration for the South and a hatred for Lincoln. And again, when you go through the house tour, they, explain what it was like to live here and the furniture and the construction of the house and all that kind of stuff. I'll skip over that for now so I don't steal their thunder, so that when you go there in person, you won't have heard everything. Piano, dining room. So again, not only can you learn about John Wilkes Booth, but you can go here about life in the 1800s. Here's the upstairs bedroom. So this was Dr. Mudd and his wife's bedroom. This is the master bedroom. And then this is the room that Booth was staying in. So they basically helped him up the stairs. And after Dr. Mudd looked at his leg, and he basically collapses in the bed and sleeps for about 12 hours, pretty much from like the 5 o'clock in the morning time frame till like the late afternoon. He's probably exhausted from not only his leg being broken, but the long ride that they had by a horse. And plus, remember, before Booth shot Lincoln, he had been up all day. So, he gets up in the morning, not realizing what's about to take place. And then he hears Lincoln's going to be at Ford's. So Booth gets up in the morning. He goes to Ford's Theater to pick up his mail around lunchtime. He hears Lincoln's going to be there. And then he has about 8 hours to plan the assassination. Now, he had some of the infrastructure in place, so to speak, because he had already been plotting the kidnapping. But he had to work really quickly. And then, of course, after he shoots Lincoln, he has to ride all night. So he was probably up close to like 36 hours before he finally got some sleep. So this is the bedroom where he was crashed out at. And again, he sleeps for quite a while. And then the evening, after around dinner time, they decide to head out. They also think that that might be a good time because it's starting to get dark out. And they're concerned about getting caught, obviously, by people looking for them. So they think that it might be safe to travel during the evening hours when it's dark out. And this isn't the exact crutch that Booth had, but Dr. Mudd basically fashioned a crutch for him to use because his leg was now really starting to bother him. And he really, Booth was not at this time able to walk under his own power. He needed to use either the crutch or have someone help him. So that's why that spur getting hung up on the flag at Ford's Theater really caused him a lot of problems. While he's there, Dr. Mudd cuts his boot off and ended up keeping it, which was really bad for Dr. Mudd because later on, the Union Army found out, the Union cavalry found out that Booth had been in this area, and they talked to Dr. Mudd. And when they ended up searching his house, they found this boot which had Booth's initials in it. So it proved to the Union cavalry that John Wilkes Booth had been at the house. So that wasn't very smart of him to keep the boot of the guy who shot the president. Now, he claimed, Mudd did, that he didn't recognize John Wilkes Booth. He said, yeah, I met John Wilkes Booth before, but I never actually met him. And even to this day, that's still pretty controversial. Some people think that probably actually is what happened. Some people say, no, he probably knew him for sure. Here's a news story from a few years ago. The family of Dr. Samuel Mudd still trying to unmuddy the name. Back in the summer of 2000, this guy from the Washington Post is talking about, basically, I'll let you read some of this, but it's basically one of Dr. Mudd's ancestors, or descendants, sorry, one of Dr. Mudd's descendants trying to basically prove to the world that his ancestor, Dr. Mudd, was not guilty of any involvement in the Lincoln assassination. Now, pretty much, almost no one wants to touch this case. So every president, I think, representatives from the Dr. Mudd family have tried to get basically his case dismissed or whatnot, or get like exonerated. And no president, Republican or Democrat, has wanted to touch this case. So it ends up being the way it is. Now, interestingly enough, I thought this was unusual. There's an elementary school in this area that's actually named after Dr. Mudd, which I don't know, I just thought that was kind of unusual because Dr. Mudd actually did end up getting convicted for assisting in the Lincoln assassination. So just as a side note there. So then after they leave Dr. Mudd's house, they continue on their journey by horseback, David Harold and John Wilkes Booth, and they go to a place called Rich Hill in a place called Belle Alton, Maryland. Now, this site is not as popular or well visited, but it's still a site that you can go see. Now, you have to go quite a bit of ways. You can see on the map what point in time we're talking about. And it's not too far from the Dr. Mudd house, like a 25-minute drive or so. And here it is. So it says, the historical marker says, mid-18th century farmhouse, was the home of Colonel Samuel Cox. This Southern sympathizer fed and sheltered fugitives John Wilkes Booth and David Harold before dawn on Easter Sunday, April 16, 1865. Following Booth's assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, Booth and Harold hid in woods until night of April 21st, when Cox's foster brother, Thomas Jones, helped them escape across the Potomac to Virginia. So this is where Booth ends up spending the most amount of time during his escape. He spends several nights here, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So this is Samuel Cox on the left. He's the owner of this property, or was at this point in time, and that's his cousin, Thomas Jones. So these two gentlemen play a huge role in hiding Booth and helping basically keep him out of harm's way for several days. So we'll talk about that in just a second. Here's a historical marker. And this is the house today. So this building is not open all the time. It's not like a place that you can go see. It's currently being renovated. And they typically are only open like 1 or 2 days a year. There's like a nonprofit organization that owns this property, and they're in the process of fixing it up. But you can imagine this is a pretty big house. It's pretty old. It's been vacant for a long time. It needs a lot of work. They basically gutted the whole inside of the house, but they're working towards getting it restored. And I'm not sure the latest status of this because of COVID, because to be honest with you, I haven't been out to this site in, let's see, 1.5 years or maybe even 2 years. But the last time I was here, they had gutted the whole inside of the house, and they were working to raise money to restore it. And again, this site's called Rich Hill, but it's still neat to visit here nonetheless. The organization that owns this property, every year they have a big event that takes place. So if you're in the DC area, you can take a look at that when COVID ends. Here's just some information on the house. Rich Hill Historic Site. Historical marker. Now, what happens is, let me scroll back. And again, we're not, unfortunately, don't have time to stop and read every single thing and every single picture, but you can always go back and watch the YouTube video. But what happens is Booth and Harold show up at this house, and they know a lot of these Southern sympathizers from their different activities of planning the Lincoln kidnapping plot. And so they end up here in the middle of the night after riding from Dr. Mudd's house. And it took them quite a while to get here because they got lost in the woods. So you remember before when I was showing you, I made the joke where I showed you the black photo with no lights and showed you how dark it was, and then I showed you the aerial photos. So this was a very rural area, even today, much more so back then. So it took them a long time. It took them like 12 hours. Let me go back to the map. Sorry, I don't like to. It took them about 12 hours to cover this distance because they got lost in the woods on the way here. So what should have been a relatively not too difficult horse ride ended up taking them like a half a day. It basically took them all night from around dinner time when they left the Mudd house to early in the morning when they arrived here. And when they get here, they identify themselves, and Cox is not inclined to have them stay in his house because he knows that if the Union cavalry come searching this area, which they probably are, and they find Booth in his house after he's killed the president, which he told them he had done, he himself, Cox, is probably a dead man. So he wants to help Booth, but he doesn't want to get too involved. So what he tells them is, listen, you can stay here, but you can't stay in my house. You have to go basically sleep out in the woods on my property. And so that's what Booth ends up doing. So that's why this is a historic site, or an important site, because Booth ends up staying here for so long. Booth was actually really pissed off that Cox wouldn't let him stay in the house. He's like, what the heck? I got a broken leg. I'm fighting for the Confederacy. I need a place to stay, and this guy won't even let me come inside his house. So big devising that. This is a picture of me taking a picture of the woods where Booth was staying in. Now, the spot that Booth was sleeping in was quite a ways away from the house than this photo. I'm actually standing right next to the edge of the house, looking off towards the woods. So Booth would have, and Arnold would have been staying in the woods, but they would have been staying pretty far off into the woods, not right on the tree line. So if you can imagine sleeping out in the woods in mid-April in Maryland, it's still pretty chilly out at that time of the year quite often. And, they were traveling lightly. They didn't have tents and cots and, bottled water and, snacks and all that kind of stuff. So they're really in kind of a precarious situation. But what happens is Cox ends up telling his cousin that these two guys are here, and the cousin ends up bringing them food every day. And in particular, Booth wanted newspapers so he could read about what had happened as far as the assassination went. Of course, during this time, the Union cavalry is looking for them. They're on their trail, scouring the area, trying to find Booth. The news has gotten out that Booth has shot Lincoln. And these are items actually that are at Ford's Theater that Booth and Harold had in their possession. So an axe, you can see Booth had a map. That's a map book on the left. He had a gun. Interesting enough, he took his toothbrush with him. You need to brush your teeth if you're out on the road. His saddle from his horse. And then if you look over here, some more items, some knives. Interestingly enough, Booth, who was known as a real ladies' man, had photos of 5 different women in his possession. So that's kind of interesting, but he was a real attractive guy to the opposite sex. And Booth kind of keeps a diary. So this was an appointment book that he had. And he actually jotted some notes down in here. So we know a little bit about what Booth was up to and what he was thinking, because he jotted down some of the thoughts in this appointment book, which was kind of turned into a diary, which was, of course, claimed when he was captured. John Wilkes Booth, let's see, part of this I want to read. Oh, carried with him few items: an appointment book that he uses, a diary, a compass, and a Bowie knife along his escape route. So basically just talking about, this is an exhibit at Ford's Theater talking about Booth's diary. I wanted to read you this caption from his diary. It kind of shows you how dramatic Booth is, and also he tends to bend the truth. He says in his diary, quote, "I struck boldly, and not as the papers say. I walked with a firm step through 1,000 of his friends." What he means by 1,000 of his friends is those were all the people that were with Lincoln at Ford's Theater. "Was stopped, but pushed on. A colonel was at his side." It wasn't really a colonel, it was Major Rathbone. He's talking about the guy who he tussled with in the Ford's Theater box. "I shouted 'Sic Semper Tyrannis' before I fired the gun," which he's lying. That did not happen at all. He did not say that before he shot Lincoln. "In jumping, broke my leg. I passed all his pickets." Pickets are like security personnel. So like when he crossed over the bridge into Maryland, he crossed the pickets, what they would call him. "Rode 60 miles that night with the bone of my leg tearing the flesh at every jump. I can never repent it, though. We hated to kill. Our country owed all our troubles to him." So I underlined that. I put that underline in myself, just so you can see this is one of the big reasons why he killed Lincoln. He felt like Lincoln was to blame for all the death, destruction that the South had encountered. "And God simply made me the instrument of his punishment. The country is not what it was. This forced union is not what I have loved. I care not what becomes of me. I have no desire to outlive my country." So interestingly enough, the second to last sentence, he says, "I care not what becomes of me." Well, if you care not what becomes of you, why are you running away? I don't know. Good question. Something to think about. So anyway, so the next big hurdle that they have to do is they have to cross the Potomac River from Maryland to Virginia. Here is our map. You can see the blue arrow in the center is pointing to where they're staying in the woods. They were there for 5 nights. So imagine sleeping out in the woods for 5 nights when you didn't really have time to prepare for such an endeavor. And then also too, again, this is in mid-April. I mean, it can get pretty warm in Washington, D.C. during the day quite often, but sometimes it's pretty night. And it was probably pretty chilly out there for them. And they don't have blankets and mattresses and all that kind of cots and tents. So they're really just roughing it. And by all accounts, John Wilkes Booth, he's really a city guy. He's not really like, for some people like, oh yeah, I could stay out in the woods for 5 nights. But yeah, if you're like an outdoorsy camper type of person, but that's not the kind of person that Booth is. So anyway, they're on their journey south, trying to get to Maryland. Remember Samuel Cox, he was the guy whose property they were staying on. And then his cousin, Thomas Jones, he plays a key role. He was bringing them food every day along with newspapers and supplies and whatnot. And Thomas Jones has a rowboat that he's going to give to Booth and basically kind of point him in the direction of Virginia so that he can get out of Maryland, get across the river, and hopefully get on to safety. This is a picture of the way the boat would have looked, basically just a rowboat. And this is the bridge crossing from Maryland to Virginia. So this is the bridge that we cross on our bus trip. I wanted to show you this just so you can get a sense of what this area looks like. And so this is the river they had to cross. Now they had to cross further to the west, which would be to the right of this photo. And the river was a little wider at that point. You got to figure they make the bridge at the most narrowest part of the river possible. So Booth, though, there was no bridge here at this point in time. So that's why he has to cross by boat. But it's really dark out at this point in time. Again, there's not a lot of development and stuff out there, particularly back at that point in time. So Booth and Harold are going to take this rowboat that they got from Thomas Jones and row across the river from Maryland to Virginia. And that's really important because Maryland, even though there was a slave state, was still part of the Union. Virginia was part of the Confederacy. And even though the war was starting to wind down, Booth felt like he would probably get more support and assistance in his escape from the citizens of Virginia than he could from any other place, although he had gotten quite a bit of assistance from Maryland. So anyway, this is a depiction of them from the newspapers of the day, showing them crossing the river. And again, this is a very rural area, and Booth has a compass, and Thomas Jones gave them a candle. But the river is being patrolled by the Union Navy, first of all, to prevent any type of Confederate smugglers or military activity, but also to look for Booth. So everyone in this area is looking for him. So there's boats and stuff patrolling the river. And so they have to be very careful not to get caught, because most people by this point in time realize that Booth is heading in this direction and they're on the lookout for him, which is why they hid out in the woods. I forgot to mention they stayed in the woods because the guy, Thomas Jones, let me go back to him, he thought the best plan to get away was to hide in the woods and then wait for kind of the all the people looking for Booth to kind of go off somewhere else, or kind of lose sight of what was happening and then slip through. He just thought that a couple days after the assassination there was just too much activity, but he thought eventually it would kind of die down and Booth could probably slip out, and he really wanted Booth to stay in the woods longer. But Booth is like, no, I can't handle it here anymore. I'm tired of sleeping in the woods, eating once a day. My leg is killing me. We have to get going. So they had a little bit of a disagreement there in terms of strategy. Again, it's very dark out here. The Union Navy is looking for Booth in addition to the Union cavalry, and they're going to sail across in this boat. And what does it look like on the river at night? Well, it looks like this. It's very dark out. And so Booth has a compass and a candle, but he doesn't want to light the candle because he's afraid if he does, the ships that are patrolling the river, the Union Navy ships, will see him. So they basically just start rowing and hope for the best. And in this photo, it doesn't really look like that far, but if it's pitch black out, how are you going to know where you're going? And so that's the problem that they run into. And if you look at this map, they started out in that black circle where it says stayed in the woods in the center of the photo. And instead of going straight across the river on kind of like a southwesterly direction, they actually ended up going due west and ended up still in Maryland, which really kind of screwed up their plan. So they were hoping to go on the river, go from Maryland to Virginia, and then kind of continue on. What happened was they ended up going on the river from one part of Maryland to some other part of Maryland. So if you see that dot where it says home of Colonel Hughes, that's where they ended up at. So they really got turned around sideways and screwed up. And then because they had been rowing so much and were so tired, they basically spent 24 hours at Hughes's place, again, sleeping out in the woods, before they tried to make it back down to Virginia again. So they lost a lot of time crossing the Potomac River. Booth initially makes some pretty good progress getting down to Dr. Mudd's house, but then after that, his progress really slows. And so an example of that, if you look at the map in the center where it says Lucas's farm, they slept in this cabin there the night of April 23rd. That was 9 days after the assassination. And so if Booth hadn't broken his leg and had all these other, side detours and whatnot, he probably could have gotten to Lucas's farm in like maybe 2 days. But because of the leg, and they had to go see Dr. Mudd, and then they were hanging out in the woods trying to avoid getting captured, and then they took the wrong route and crossing the river, they really lose about a week's worth of time, which was really detrimental because it allows the Union cavalry and everyone else looking for him to track him down. So an important part of the story is them crossing the river, this kind of lack of planning, like how are they going to see. Now, another issue they had is when they left Maryland, look at that boat. You can't take horses on a boat like that. So they had to shoot their horses before they left. And so they don't have any means of transportation once they get to the other side of the water. So this whole lack of planning and these time delays really led to Booth's demise. I wanted to talk just briefly about the John Brown site, which is at Harpers Ferry, Maryland. I'll explain why in just a minute. So this is a great historic site to go visit. John Brown was an abolitionist. He tried to lead a slave insurrection in late 1859, and he was caught and put on trial and found guilty, and he's going to be executed by the United States government. And the reason why I'm including this part of the story is John Wilkes Booth actually went to John Brown's execution. And so he saw John Brown being hung by the federal government. This is John Brown on his way to his execution. This is a contemporary painting. And this is Brown being hung on December 2nd, that's actually a typo. Sorry, that should say 1859. That was not 1959. But anyway, Booth is at John Brown's execution and he sees him hung. And the reason why that's important is because Booth did not want to end up like John Brown. He did not want to be hung by the federal government. So he's really adamant that he's not going to be taken alive. And so that's one of the reasons why Booth ends up getting shot and killed is because he does not want to end up like John Brown, who he saw his funeral. So let's talk about Garrett's Farm. This is a place called Port Royal, Virginia. Booth's plan is to the Washington, D.C. is where that blue star is on the right side of the map. Booth's plan is to head southwest, and where he's going to end up at, he's not even really sure himself. Davy Harrell said that they were talking about maybe going to Mexico or something. He knows he's probably got to get a long way from Washington, D.C., maybe even leave the country. But at this point in time, they're just trying to get as far away from D.C. as possible. They're not making a lot of progress because of, again, all the issues he had with their trip, which really starts slowing down their escape route. And then here's the drive from the Rich Hill farmhouse, that building that was being renovated, to the Garrett Farm site. It's about 45 minutes to an hour. Now, this is another key thing that causes Booth to get caught. There's a river called the Rappahannock River. It's in Virginia. And let me see if I can show you through a map. You see on this map at the bottom of the screen, you see where the blue and red arrows are pointing to that X. That's where Booth gets shot and killed at Garrett's Farm. But if you look a little bit above that, you see a blue line, and that's the Rappahannock River. And then you can see it a little bit again on this map. So it's not as big as the Potomac River, but they still have to cross it. And here is a ferry from that era. And so if you look across this waterway, I mean, you know, you probably could swim across that if you had to, but are you going to be able to do that with a broken leg? And, you know, probably not. And so they're going to have to take the ferry across. The ferry would manually pull them from one side to the other. And so this ferry ride really ends up being one of the final things that causes Booth to get caught. So they basically, let me back up, how they got from the Virginia shore down to this ferry, they basically had a couple different people give them rides. They basically met people that gave them horse and carriage rides down to this ferry because, again, they don't have horses themselves. Booth tried to buy some horses. He couldn't procure any. They get to the ferry and they get dropped off. And then while they're at the ferry, these 4 Confederate soldiers show up who are on their way home from the war. And Booth starts talking to them, and basically telling them, hey, listen, we need a ride. You know, will you guys be able to give us a ride to where we're going? And they're like, well, where are you going? We're going to Richmond. And they're like, well, we're not going that far, but we'll give you a ride. So because Booth and Harold have no transportation, and Booth can't walk, they need some miracle to continue on their journey. It just so happens they meet these 4 Confederate soldiers who give them a ride on their horses. But that ends up leading to their downfall, because what's happening back in Washington is Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, he's in charge of the investigation into the Lincoln assassination. He's also in charge of tracking down Booth, the manhunt, so to speak. And so Stanton is a war dog, and he's very adamant he's going to do everything humanly possible to catch Booth. And he's basically put the whole entire resources of the federal government at his disposal to go track down Booth. And so that's what's taking place. Of course, there's these reward posters that are floating around. There was $100,000 reward. I mean, imagine how many millions of dollars that would have been back in 1865. So pretty much everybody who was able to is scouring the country looking for John Wilkes Booth. And far away is New York City and Chicago and Texas and England and you name it. People are looking for Booth. So the Union cavalry, they're going for, now they're coming across clues of places where Booth has been. They had talked to Dr. Mudd and found out he had been there. And so they surmise that he's probably heading south towards Virginia, which really intensifies the manhunt in that area. And what happens is the Union cavalry one day, they show up at the ferry and they ask the owners of the ferry, who the owners weren't necessarily Southern sympathizers. They were kind of neutral, as a fair number of people in Virginia were. And so the Union cavalry shows up at this ferry and says, hey, have you seen any suspicious people here? In particular, a guy with a broken leg. And they say, yeah, you know, actually there was a guy with a broken leg came through here. And of course, the Union cavalry was like, wow, well, where did he go? And they said, well, you know, we're not sure, but we actually know one of the guys that he was with. So it just so happened that the ferry owner knew one of the Union soldiers, not like as a friend, but just kind of as an acquaintance, knew who he was. And so they basically tell the Union cavalry that, oh, the guy with the broken leg and the person that was accompanying him, and they knew Booth and Harold were traveling together. Yeah, he went to this guy, this Confederate soldier. They probably went to his house. And so the Union cavalry storms off and goes to this soldier's house and basically knocks on the door, and they get a hold of him. They say, hey, where's the guy with the broken leg? He says, listen, they're holding guns at him, telling him they're going to shoot him if he doesn't cooperate. And he agrees to come along with the Union soldiers, the cavalry, and show him where he dropped Booth off, and they dropped him off at Garrett's farm. And so the cavalry now has this hot lead that the guy with the broken leg, who's probably Booth, and this other guy, who's David Harold, are at this place called Garrett's Farm. And so they waste no time. They showed up at the soldier's house in the middle of the night, like after midnight, and they immediately proceed to Garrett's Farm. They don't even wait for the next morning. They want to go ASAP. And they basically tell the soldier, the Confederate soldier, that this is a trap. They're going to kill him on the spot if he's lying to them. He swears he's not. They show up at Garrett's Farm. They approach and they knock on the door and bring the occupants. So Garrett's farm was a farm, and there's people living there and whatnot. So they talk to the owners and say, hey, where's the guy with the broken leg? And fortunately for Thomas Garrett, the owner of the farm, he was suspicious of Booth. And so he made Booth and Harold sleep out in the barn. He did not have them sleeping in the house. So when the Union cavalry shows up, and they say, hey, where's the guy with the broken leg? And the owner of the house, Thomas Garrett, says, why do you want to know, or what guy are you talking about? They basically call his bluff and say, listen, if you don't cooperate with us, we're going to shoot you. And so he tells them, oh, yeah, okay, the guy's over in the barn. Booth and Harold are in the barn, and the Union cavalry surrounds it. And so again, their spot got discovered because of that ferry ride, and the Union cavalry coming across the person that just so happened to know one of the soldiers. So they surround the barn, the Union cavalry does, and they order Booth to come out. And there's this long back and forth between Booth and the Union cavalry. He doesn't want to give up. The cavalry's a little concerned about storming the building because Booth's inside there with a gun, and none of them want to get shot trying to storm the building. So they're trying to get him to come out. He doesn't want to come out. Eventually, Harold surrenders, David Harold, and so they take him into custody. But Booth's still inside the barn at Garrett's Farm. So this isn't the actual barn. It's just an example of what a barn in Maryland from this era would have looked like. Let's see. And so again, they're going back and forth and trying to get him to come out. He doesn't want to come out. And then eventually what they decide to do to flush him out is they're going to light the barn on fire and force Booth to do something and come out. And so they light the barn on fire. Basically, one of the soldiers sneaks up on it, lights a match, and lights all the hay on fire. And that's where the story starts coming to a close. So one of the soldiers actually sees Booth reaching for his gun. And before this takes place, they can see Booth kind of scurrying around the barn because it's all lit up inside now with the fire. And one of the soldiers sees Booth reaching for his gun, and he in turn, to prevent Booth from shooting any of the soldiers on the outside, shoots Booth with a single shot in the neck and ends up killing him. And that soldier is named Boston Corbett, who is a interesting character in his own right. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to talk about some of his many other endeavors that he was involved with. He's the guy who shot and killed John Wilkes Booth, Boston Corbett of the New York U.S. Cavalry. And they drag Booth out of the barn to the house and basically put him on the porch. And he's alive for a few hours. He's talking kind of some different things. They're trying to get information from him and whatnot. He's not really overly cooperative. They're trying to give him water to keep him alive. They really the instructions were to capture Booth alive. I mean, if he has to be dead, that's fine. But they really, back in Washington, wanted to capture Booth alive because at this point in time, they don't know if he's involved in some larger conspiracy with the Confederate government. So they want to basically capture him alive and interrogate him. And if he's dead, they're not able to do that. So the soldiers that were in command of the cavalry unit were kind of upset that Booth had been shot and was on his way to dying because they wanted to take him back to Washington alive. But anyway, they give him water and stuff, whatnot, and he basically is asking him questions and whatnot. And then finally, his last words were, he was pretty much paralyzed from the gunshot because it hit him in the neck, and he's pretty much paralyzed from the neck down. And the last words he says was, I think he said, "Tell mother I die for my country." That was the second to last thing he said. And then he looked at his hands, and for whatever reason, he said, useless, useless. So the last two words that John Wilkes Booth said was when he was looking at his hands, and he said, for whatever reason, useless, useless, and then he died. And you can go to this spot. So this is the culmination of our bus trip. This is a historical marker that's on the way to Garrett's Farm. It says on this road 2 miles south is the Garrett Place. There, John Wilkes Booth, Lincoln's assassin, was found by Union cavalry and killed while resisting arrest, April 26, 1865. Let me go back. I don't like to go back if I can avoid, but I just want to mention this point. So again, the whole breaking his leg was really detrimental. Not planning out his trip, taking 9 days to get across the river from Maryland to Virginia did him in. But then the thing that really got him caught was this ferry ride, because when the soldiers showed up and started interrogating the people on the ferry, and they knew one of the soldiers that was traveling with Booth that he had just happened to run into, that ends up leading to his downfall. And that's why they're able to circumvent Garrett Farm, and he ends up getting shot and killed. And this is our van on our inaugural bus trip out here. Now, this site where Booth is killed, it's not a historical site per se. There's not a museum here or anything. It's actually part of an army unit. So they don't want public basically coming in here. I think it's Fort A.P. Hill, if I'm not mistaken, which interesting enough was the name of a Confederate general. But this is the sign out there. So there's not like a museum or anything that you can see. This was our first time we went out here. This was our inaugural bus trip crew standing in front of the sign. And the sign says Assassin's End. This is the site of Locust Hill, Richard Henry's Garrett's Farm. Early on the morning of 26 April 1865, a 16th New York Cavalry Detachment cornered John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of President Abraham Lincoln, and his co-conspirator David E. Harold, as the two men slept in Garrett's tobacco barn. Harold gave himself up, but Booth refused to surrender. The barn was set on fire, and Sergeant Boston Corbett shot the assassin, still inside. Booth was laid on the porch of Garrett House and died about sunrise. The house and barn stood a short distance from this spot. So this gives you a sense of what this site looks like. Again, this is the sign from the other direction, but it's basically, it's the historical marker is basically on a road that goes through the woods. So there's not, like a Starbucks here or a museum or anything like that to see. It's really just this sign. And I'm kind of surprised that they don't have like at least a pull off or something, because if you look on the internet, there's like a zillion people that go through here and stop at this site to check it out. But Booth was shot and killed. He died on April 26, 1865, 12 days after shooting Lincoln. So there's a few more kind of interesting postscript items to the story. Let's go through those before we wrap things up. Booth's body was taken back to Washington, D.C. by a horse and then boat. And then, of course, Booth, because he was killed, didn't go on trial, but a number of the conspirators did. That's David Harold in the center on the top. He was put on trial, found guilty, and put to death, as were three of the other conspirators, including Mary Surratt. We talked about her earlier. This is where the trial took place. It's a building in Washington, D.C. You can actually visit this site today. There's a few times a year it's usually open to the public, and you can kind of walk around. So this is where the trial took place of the Lincoln conspirators, not Booth, of course, but all the other ones. And some of them were found guilty, some were found not guilty, but this is the building where it took place. And again, before COVID, I think like 3 or 4 times a year, they would be open to the public. You can come in here and kind of look around. This is what it looks like today. So imagine this historic trial taking place of the Lincoln conspirators right in here. So you can check this out in Washington, D.C. Some images of the trial. And that's the defendants in the back row. This is where it was a military trial. So the jury were all military men. Wasn't a regular jury trial, which caused some controversy. And the defendants that were found guilty, some of them were sentenced to prison terms. 4 of them were found guilty and sentenced to death. These are just some historical depictions of that taking place. And here, this was initially a black and white photo that someone colorized to make it more lifelike, but that's Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, David Harold, and George Attisrod getting ready to be hung. So what they do is they basically they had them bound and blindfolded. And they basically, or hoods over their heads, and basically marched them up the stairs. They put them on this platform, and they put the noose around their neck, and then the bottom of the platform drops out, and they're hung. Sorry, this is a little bit of a graphic photo, but just wanted to show you this. So if this is bothering you, just bear with me for a second. And the trial was, and the execution was really quick. So again, Lincoln died on April 15th. Look at the date of the execution, July 7th, 1865. So really quickly, less than 3 months later. So justice was very swift for these individuals. And what is this site where the Lincoln conspirators were hung at? What is it now? Well, it's a tennis court. Imagine that. So this gentleman is he's standing on the tennis court. So this is part of a military complex. And so the scaffolding that was used to basically hang these 4 people, it went through different purposes, but now it's a tennis court, interestingly enough. So go figure. And then again, we'll have that screening about the Mary Surratt film. You're free to watch it on your own before then if you want to, but it's called The Killing of Mary Surratt, and we're going to screen it on July 7th, which is a Wednesday night in a few weeks. So again, you're welcome to join us for that. When it's not on our calendar yet, it'll probably be on our calendar starting June 7th. But I'll send the invitation out as a reminder when we do put on an account, if you want to come join us for that, or you can check it out yourself. This film, by the way, is a little bit controversial because it's somewhat sympathetic to Mary Surratt's situation, just as a FYI. And then people always ask me what books I recommend on different subjects. And these are the 2 that are my favorite on the Lincoln assassination and the John Wilkes Booth escape route. The first one is called They Have Killed Papa Dead. It's by Washington, D.C. based author Anthony Pitch, who was a friend of mine. Unfortunately, he passed away about a year or a year and a half ago, if I'm not mistaken. But he really wrote this excellent book, They Have Killed Papa Dead. It's really a fascinating book because he has a lot of information in his book about from diary entries and letters that people wrote. So you're hearing like him kind of giving firsthand accounts of people that were involved in the Lincoln assassination, just from these letters that he tracked down, or these diary entries that he got a hold of. It's really fascinating. And then another excellent book is by James Swanson. It's called Manhunt. And our organization, Washington, D.C. History and Culture, we actually have a history book club. And one of the first books we read, it's not hosted by me, it's hosted by someone else, but one of the first books that we read was Manhunt. And so that's actually what prompted this bus tour. We read the book in our book club, and we started talking about it at the restaurant we were meeting at, like, wow, it'd really be cool to go drive out there and check out these sites. And then they're like, yeah, that'd really be neat. Let's go do that. And so the trip is actually a byproduct, or came from, our book club meeting that we had several years ago. So thanks to Dave Kramer for that. And again, this is the Abraham Lincoln Assassination Ford's Theater program we had a few weeks ago, which goes into more detail about the actual assassination Ford's Theater. If you wanted to watch that, or if you joined us late for this one or want to watch this one again, remember they're both on our YouTube page, so you can join us for that. I think we have like 90 some videos now on our YouTube page. You can check that out. You can subscribe to Washington, D.C. History and Culture, find all kinds of different interesting things on there on a variety of historical and cultural subjects. And hopefully we'll see you in person someday, either at Ford's Theater or on our bus trip. So there's different organizations that do the John Wilkes Booth bus trip. Of course, none of them are doing them now because of COVID, but we're not the only ones. It's not a lot of different groups, but there are other places, or you could just kind of go do it yourself. I tried to give you as many tips and suggestions and whatnot, so that you're free to check it out on your own. But we'll start our in-person programs up at some point in time in the future, both our Ford's Theater tour and our John Wilkes Booth bus tour. So hopefully we will see you someday in person, since it seems like we're finally getting COVID under control. All of our in-person programming has been on hold since March 9th of last year. We've not open back up. We'll do so at some point in time, but I want it to be safe for people to do so. And again, Abraham Lincoln, born February 12th, 1809, died on April 15th, 1865. And so with that, I want to say thank you for joining us. It was a great honor to share this information on Abraham Lincoln and his assassination with you, these two programs. And I want to thank you so much for joining us. Just FYI, again, we're a nonprofit organization. If you want to find out more programs we host, you can do so on Facebook, Meetup, Eventbrite, and YouTube. And all of the programmings that we've done online since May of last year, every single one has been free. And the reason why they're free for everyone is because a handful of people make donations throughout the days, weeks, and months. And if you're ever interested in supporting the work we do, you can make a donation to our programs through PayPal or Venmo. If you're not able to make a donation, or if you don't worry about it, we're happy to have you come regardless, which is why we always keep our programs free. If you've made a donation in the past, thank you very much. And if you make one at some point in time in the future, we would greatly appreciate that. It allows us to continue offering these programs to the community. So again, thank you very much. Hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Have a great weekend. And let's remember our great president, Abraham Lincoln. So bye, everyone. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your evening and weekend, and hope to see you at some point in time in the future. Take care.